morning. My name is Ben Bingle, and I'm the Director of Grants and the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership at the DeKalb County Community Foundation. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on sexual harassment, recognition, reporting, and prevention. Today's training is being offered collaboratively between the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership, the DeKalb Chamber of Commerce, the Genoa Area Chamber of Commerce, Safe Passage, the Sandwich Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Sycamore Chamber of Commerce. And I want to thank all of those partnering organizations. A few housekeeping points before we get started. First, we will be recording today's webinar, and that recording will be sent to you by email along with the slides. We also have everyone muted, but feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom, and we'll save a little bit of time at the end to address questions that you submit. Finally, we'll be sending a certificate of participation to everyone who registered and is attending live right now. Our plan is to send that certificate by Monday at noon. Since it's going to be a mass email, we ask that you please monitor your spam or your junk folder in case it ends up there. This will be separate from the follow-up email that we will be sending later on today that includes a recording, and we appreciate your patience as we distribute those certificates. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Linnea Erickson-Laskowski as today's presenter. Linnea has been with Safe Passage for 5 years. She's a graduate of Northern Illinois University's Master of Public Administration program, and she's been working with nonprofit organizations and governmental agencies in the community since 2011. Welcome, Linnea. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. So glad to be with you this morning. And so glad to be able to have this discussion. I know this is an incredibly important conversation as well as a mandated one. So very glad to be with you all and hoping that as we walk through this mandated presentation that you also find that this is helpful and useful for you. As Ben said, my name is Linnea Erickson-Laskowski. I'm the Director of Prevention and Communication with Safe Passage. If you are not familiar with Safe Passage, we are DeKalb County's Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Crisis Center. You can see on your screen right now a list of many of the services we provide. As I'm talking today about issues connected to sexual harassment and sexual abuse, if anything that I'm saying is reminding you of an experience that you have gone through or bringing up any memories or any experiences that you would like to process further, please feel free to reach out to Safe Passage. We are available 24 hours a day. We have counselors who are available. We have legal advocates who can assist you with any questions you might have about any of the legal aspects about what we're talking today, as well as anything else that may come to mind. We also just have trained professionals who are available 24 hours a day if you just need to have a quick conversation or need some support in that moment. We are available by phone. You can contact us by calling 815-756-5228, or you can also text us. If you would like to send a text message, we have trained professionals answering those texts live, and you can reach us by texting 815-393-1995. I also will give you that contact information again before the end of the presentation as we open the floor for questions. So if you're looking for that again, I will be sharing that as we get through the presentation. So what are our goals for today? Again, recognizing this is a mandate from the state that we do this kind of education every year, really for everyone who is involved in the business community, whether you're working for a nonprofit, a small business, a large corporation, everyone is required to have this education annually. And it's really easy to think about this as a box that we tick and say, great, we did our mandatory education. We watched our 5-minute video that was made in 1984. We're all good. That's not my goal for this time. I know your time is valuable, and that you've given up an hour for this is very important to me. And I really want to make sure that we are making the most of the time that we have together and making sure that this training is more than just a requirement, but really is a helpful and useful tool as you think about how do we make our business community better? How do we make our organizations better? How do we make our community safer? So my goal for the next hour or so is to make sure we understand legal definitions of sexual harassment. Make sure we all know what sexual harassment is and think through how does that actually play out in the real world. We know the definition, but what does that actually look like maybe in some broader examples that we see in our culture, but also what could that look like in our own organizations? Understand the impact of sexual harassment. Why does this matter that we talk about this? Share resources, particularly related to how do you report this if this is going on in your workspace. And then how can we intervene when we see these situations coming up? Maybe there's something going on. I don't feel like I'm going to make a call to a federal agency about this, but I really do wish I had the tools to be able to let my coworker know that their behavior is inappropriate. We're going to talk about some really easy ways that we can practice bystander intervention each and every day. As we go through, as Ben mentioned, please feel free to use that Q&A function. Please also feel free to use the chat box. I do see some people jumping in to introduce themselves, which is wonderful. Thank you all so much. If you would like to introduce yourself, let me know where you're coming from. That helps me get a feel for who's in the room, but I know we've got a lot of us in the room, so don't feel like you need to do that if you're not interested. But also feel free to use that chat box as we're going through to really flesh out in your experience, what could this look like? This is going to be different if we're talking about a food pantry versus talking about a distribution plant versus talking about a Chamber of Commerce office. We see sexual harassment happening differently in different spaces. So I'd love for you to be thinking about and sharing about what could this look like in the spaces that you inhabit, and sharing that information. I'll ask some questions. So feel free to jump in the chat and just let me know what you're thinking about. How could this be something that we see in our own organization? And of course, if you have any questions or concerns, anything that I'm saying that I am breezing through too quickly, or if you feel like, Linnea, we get it, move along, feel free to let me know any of those things in the chat, any questions you have, any specific circumstances you want me to address. I want to make sure that this hour is as useful to you as possible. So please feel free to let me know any questions you have or any thoughts that you have as we're going through. All right. So why does this matter? As we think about this, there's a few different considerations that we want to make sure we're thinking about. If we're on the administrative side, or we're a business owner or a manager, we really want to be aware that sexual harassment is a driving issue behind turnover in our organizations. If our workers don't feel safe, if our colleagues don't feel safe in the workplace, they're not going to stay there. The minute they can find a place to, a way to jump ship or a different job that they can take, they're going to be out of our workplaces. And we are losing good staff because they just don't feel safe or comfortable in our workplaces. So by addressing sexual harassment, by having proactive policies in place, by being thoughtful with our employees, we reduce turnover and improve productivity, and we reduce liability costs and risks. Workers who come to work every day feeling safe and able to thrive are going to do their best work and are going to create the best organizations and businesses that we can have. Someone who is afraid of how they're going to be treated is not going to be able to come into work and focus on their job, is not going to be someone who's committed to staying. So by making sure that our workplaces are safe, we reduce that turnover, we improve productivity, and of course, we reduce the risk that we're going to get sued. So we talk about this because that has an impact on our bottom line. It has an impact on our productivity and our ability to provide goods or services, but also because it's just the right thing to do. This mandate was passed in Illinois. You're here in this training because it's a legal requirement, but also because this is something we need. We've seen over the last few years with the resurgence of the Me Too movement, as we saw that explode, more online on Twitter, people sharing their experiences of sexual harassment in various industries, we've really recognized or started to have the conversation that this is more of a problem than maybe some people realize. This is much more widespread than we wanted to admit. So as we address sexual harassment in the workplace and as we work to be proactive about preventing it, we're really just doing the decent thing. We're really doing the basics of being empathetic and caring human beings. It's just the right thing to do to make sure that everyone feels safe in our workplace. And we want to make sure as we think about what we're trying to prevent here, we're not just trying to prevent lawsuits or criminal activity. If we're just here because we don't want to get sued, that's a really low bar. If we're just here because we're checking the box so we can say we did the sexual harassment prevention training, we're all good for the next year, that's a really low bar. We want to make sure that we're recognizing that actions don't have to be illegal, to be unacceptable in a safe, supportive working environment. So we're going to talk about what the legal definitions are and what those legal limits are, but we're also going to try to dive a little bit deeper into making sure that we're being proactive enough that this isn't just about not getting sued. This is about making sure our employees are safe and able to thrive and produce their highest quality of work in our workplaces. All right. And as we think about sexual harassment, and as we're talking about this today, it's important that we make sure we understand who sexual harassment really impacts. And sexual harassment, like any other form of abuse, can really affect anyone. At Safe Passage, in our work working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, we see that there is not one gender that is affected by these types of violence. There's not one socioeconomic status that is affected by these types of violence. There's not one race or ethnicity that's impacted by these types of violence. Abuse can happen to anyone. We often hear, particularly when we're talking about sexual harassment, we hear often about stories of this happening to young women early in their careers by older men. And that certainly is a common form of sexual harassment. That's a common way that power plays into how sexual harassment can happen. But that is not exclusively the only people impacted by sexual harassment. Sexual harassment can happen to men. It can happen to non-binary individuals. It can happen to people who've been in the workplace for a very long time, as well as people who have been newly in the workplace. It can happen to supervisors. It can happen to supervisees. Sexual harassment, like any other form of abuse, can affect anyone. However, we also know that harassment is born out of power differentials. Anytime there's a power imbalance in our workplaces, and workplaces inherently will have power imbalances, that's part of the structure of work environments, is that there will be different levels of power. But those different levels of power, if we're not proactively thinking about that, those different levels of power can lead to harassment or can lead to individuals taking advantage of those power differentials to cause abusive or unhealthy work environments. And we need to recognize that marginalized populations within our workplaces, especially staff and clients who have intersecting identities, people who already experience marginalization in our communities due to their sexual orientation or gender identity, individuals who experience marginalization due to their race and racism, due to transphobia or ableism, individuals with disabilities, people with intersecting identities that have historically been oppressed or marginalized in our community will face increased rates of harassment and face increased difficulty reporting that harassment. So harassment can happen to anyone, but people who have historically been denied power within our workplaces or within our culture are going to experience that harassment more often and also have a harder time accessing the resources that are intended to help them. So we really want to be as proactive as possible about recognizing where there may be those power imbalances in our workplaces and how we can be proactive about preventing any abuse that might come along with that power differential. So the federal and state laws, this is the legalese that I'm going to jump in here with. At an Illinois and federal level, the laws against sexual harassment state that sexual harassment is any unwanted sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or conduct of a sexual nature when submission to such conduct is explicitly or implicitly made a term or condition of employment. Submission to or rejection of such conduct is used as the basis for making decisions about your employment, or such conduct interferes with your job performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Now, like I said, that's a lot of legal language. I'm going to break that down further for you. What that means essentially is that there's two different forms of sexual harassment that we're going to be talking about today. The first form of sexual harassment is going to be quid pro quo sexual harassment. The second is going to be hostile work environment sexual harassment. And we're actually going to break that hostile work environment sexual harassment down even further to the three main types of behaviors that we see leading to hostile work environments: gender hostility, unwanted sexual attention, and sexual coercion. So quid pro quo, we'll start with this. Quid pro quo sexual harassment is requests for sexual favors in exchange for employment or advancement. Quid pro quo is Latin. It means this for that. Quid pro quo is all about an exchange. So quid pro quo means someone has a job, an opportunity, a resource, and they're exchanging that job, opportunity, or resource for sexual favors or sexual coercion. So requests for sexual favors in exchange for employment or advancement. This is the most visible form of sexual harassment. If we have a high-profile case of sexual harassment that's being reported on in the news, or the kind of case that maybe we all would recognize the names or the details, it's almost always a quid pro quo sexual harassment case, because it's just the easiest to look at and point to and say, yes, it is clearly sexual harassment when someone says, sleep with the boss in order to get hired, or date your supervisor and then you get better work shifts, or then you get a pay raise. It's very clear that those things are wrong. So this is one of the most visible forms of sexual harassment. It's not the most common form of sexual harassment, but it's probably the one that most of us think of when we think of cases of sexual harassment in the workplace. So this is a moment to jump in the chat. I've seen a lot of people introducing themselves, but if anyone would like to jump in and let me know if you can think of any high-profile cases of quid pro quo sexual harassment that come to mind. Things that have gone on in the news, things you might have seen, high-profile cases that have gone to trial or have been talked about a lot, anything that comes to mind. Say two names already jumping in the chat, Dr. Nasser and Harvey Weinstein. Dr. Nasser has just a whole host of issues around sexual abuse and sexual harassment that we could certainly spend hours diving into, and I do on a regular basis. Talk about him for hours is a great case example of how not to behave. And Harvey Weinstein is probably the quintessential case that I point to when we're talking about quid pro quo sexual harassment. He is just a perfect case example of someone who has exploited their power and their position in exchange for sexual favors. So for anyone who is not familiar with Harvey Weinstein was a high-profile Hollywood movie producer who produced some of the biggest name films that we have. His work is well known to pretty much everyone who's seen any movies at any time. We've probably all seen a movie that was produced by the Harvey Weinstein Company. Harvey Weinstein was also well known for being a super creepy guy who would frequently employ sort of the stereotypical Hollywood casting couch director sort of hiring method, where if you slept with Harvey Weinstein, he would cast you in his movies, or he would hire you for his company. If you let him be very creepy and inappropriate with you, he would cast you in his movies or hire you for his company. If you told him no, if you told him you weren't interested in his advances, if you shut him down, if you threatened to go to the police, if you did report him, you were never going to work in Hollywood again. Not just that you wouldn't get cast in his movie, but you were never going to work somewhere else again. There are high-profile actresses, particularly, who really had their careers ruined because they were not women who would put up with the behaviors that Harvey Weinstein was enacting. I think particularly of people like Kate Beckinsale, who had a pretty promising career. Ashley Judd had a pretty promising career. Both of them had run-ins with Harvey Weinstein where they did not allow his advances, and then they really couldn't get hired for movies anymore. And this is not just something that happened to actresses. There are stories of young female lawyers working for his company, interns, accountants, who found if they turned him down, if they didn't come to his hotel room after hours, if they threatened to report him to the police, they found that it was incredibly difficult to get a job in the entertainment industry going forward. And of course, he's been convicted on those charges in New York and is still awaiting trial in California. So that idea that one person has a job and they will give it to you if you will sleep with them, date them, put up with their harassing behaviors. It's easy to point to these sorts of things when we think about some of the people we're naming in the chat, people like Jeffrey Epstein, yes, the Chicago Park District lifeguard director, Roger Ailes. It was well known that Roger Ailes used to say to the young women applying for for jobs at Fox News, if you want to play with the big boys, you've got to lay with the big boys. So essentially implying you have to sleep your way to the top in this company. Bill Cosby, Andrew Cuomo. It's really easy to point to those high-profile cases and say that's clearly quid pro quo sexual harassment. But it's also important to really think through what could this look like on a smaller scale in our organization. Maybe not a Harvey Weinstein, but what might it look like if someone who works at works at a food pantry is doing this? What could our hiring director try to get away with if they were that type of person? Do we have oversight in place so we know that the person who hires our employees isn't putting any pressure on someone to exchange sexual favors in exchange for employment or advancement? What if our volunteers are threatening to withhold resources from someone who doesn't put up with their harassing behaviors? I did a training quite a few months ago with a local food pantry, and we were talking about how this could potentially come up in an organization similar to theirs. Not that it has, but just, hypothetically being proactive. And one of the things we talked about was at a food pantry, you usually have people who are really in need of those food resources. And what if you had a volunteer or a staff member who was saying, well, if you sleep with me, I'll give you first choice of the food resources you really need. Or in an organization like Safe Passage that offers emergency shelter to individuals fleeing domestic violence. What if you had a staff member who said, well, if you let me kiss you, there'll be a bed for you in our shelter tonight, but if you threaten to tell your supervisor what I said, I'm going to tell you that you're not qualified for our services. What if someone is withholding resources like a nonprofit might have? Or what if someone is withholding a job or a promotion from someone who's not willing to put up with their behavior? So think through what that could look like at your organization. We don't want to wait for a Harvey Weinstein or say that this only happens in Hollywood. This is something that can happen in small businesses, in organizations, in local governments. This is something that can happen anywhere. All right, the next form of sexual harassment, and this is actually the most common form of sexual harassment, is a hostile work environment. So hostile work environment sexual harassment is unwanted sexual conduct, even without a quid pro quo threat that creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So with quid pro quo sexual harassment, that's almost always coming from a top-down sort of approach. Someone who has resources or power, who is using those resources or power to exploit someone else beneath them, or someone who has less power than them. With a hostile work environment, it certainly can be that way. Someone who is in a position of power, like a boss or a hiring manager, who's using their position to make other people uncomfortable. But it's also something that can be from peer to peer, from coworker to coworker. It's even something that we've seen certain cases where it can be from coworkers to the person who is supervising them, where they create such an uncomfortable environment that it makes it difficult for people to do their jobs. With hostile work environment sexual harassment, you don't have to have that threat hanging over your head of I could get fired or I might not get hired. You don't need that quid pro quo threat. If someone is just making it so difficult for you to do your job that you can't function, that could be a form of hostile work environment sexual harassment. And like I said, this is much less likely to be something we see in the news. This is much less likely to be something that we see going to a trial, but this is in fact much more common when we think of sexual harassment and what we know of the kinds of cases that are actually going on every day in workplaces. It's much more likely to be the kind of sexual harassment where the people around you just make you feel so uncomfortable with the things they say or the jokes they tell or the way they treat you, that it's very difficult for you to come to work each day and focus on your job. So like I said, we're going to break down what hostile work environment sexual harassment looks like. It's unwanted sexual attention or gender hostility, which can look like sexist harassment or gender policing. And again, a reminder that this doesn't require a quid pro quo threat. This could be your boss who's making you feel this way, but it could also be your coworker or even someone who works for you. It doesn't have to be a situation where it has to be coming from the top down. It certainly could be, and that could make it more common that it's happening at a wider scale, but it also could be something that really is just the workplace culture across all levels of power. So we'll talk first about unwanted sexual attention. I think several people named Andrew Cuomo in the chat when we were talking about quid pro quo sexual harassment. I would also really highlight him here For hostile work environment sexual harassment, other people that I think of off the top of my head are people like Mayor Bloomberg, who kind of got into some hot water in the 2016 Democratic debates when he was running for president, when it became public that there were quite a few non-disclosure agreements that had been signed at Bloomberg News at his company. Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill absolutely is another great example of unwanted sexual attention. It can be from a superior to someone who works for them, like President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, or Andrew Cuomo, who's the governor, and young employees who are working for him. Or it could be from from anyone in the organization. But unwanted sexual attention can look like that person who is always touching the small of your back when they walk past you. I think of some of those pictures of Andrew Cuomo that were shared in the news when the stories were breaking about the sexual harassment allegations against him and against his office in New York. There were pictures of him standing very close to young women at work functions or at weddings and things of that nature, where he would always have his hand on their back. Or there's one picture where he's grabbing a woman's face and is really close up to her, that uncomfortable close contact with someone that you work with. I think of, it's been a few years now, but there were allegations of sexual harassment against Garrison Keillor. If anyone's an NPR listener who used to listen to Lake Wobegon on Sunday mornings on NPR, it was some young people were alleging that every time he saw them at an event or in public, he would come up and put his hand on their back, but like under their shirt, put his hand on their back. Just that uncomfortable touching that maybe isn't blatantly sexual in nature, but makes you feel very uncomfortable. So unwanted touching or groping, very blatantly sexual, or just someone, who's always touching you when they maybe don't need to, who's always walking a little bit too close to you or too close behind you, always making it a point to, give you a back rub without you asking, or, someone who makes inappropriate contact that you're not comfortable with. Someone who's making sexual comments in the workplace, even if they're framing them as compliments. A lot of times you hear people who will comment on what someone looks like or what someone's wearing in the workplace. And when you tell them that's inappropriate, they say, well, it was just a compliment. Can I not even compliment people anymore? Well, there's a difference between saying, I really appreciate the work you're doing, and saying, I really appreciate the way your butt looks in our uniform. There's one that's appropriate for the workplace, and there's one that's pretty clearly not. Asking inappropriate questions or sharing inappropriate stories or jokes. You may think that, I'm coming into work, I'm good friends with the people I work with, we're just swapping stories, telling jokes, this is just how I interact with my friends. You're allowed to do that on your own time outside of work, but if you're in your work environment, the way you interact with people, just because you consider them friendly or your friends, doesn't mean that you have the right to behave unprofessionally in the workplace. And you never know that those people might be uncomfortable with the stories that you're telling or the jokes you're telling, or there might be someone else who's overhearing your banter that is made to feel uncomfortable because of that. Asking inappropriate questions is something we also see. Asking questions about someone's dating history or someone's sexual history. We see this oftentimes happening for LGBTQIA+ coworkers who get asked inappropriate questions about their relationships or get asked inappropriate questions about their bodies. And people seem to think that because someone is a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, that they should use their work time to educate other people about what it means to be gay, or what it means to be trans, or what it means to be bisexual. And that's, again, if you wouldn't ask your straight colleagues those questions, it's not something that's appropriate to ask your LGBTQIA+ colleagues those questions. Sharing sexual images or videos. Of course, if you've got that sexy fireman calendar hanging up in your office, you might not feel like that's a big deal, but again, it's a professional workplace. It's not really your space. You can hang that calendar up at home, but you can't hang that up in your workplace because it may make someone else feel uncomfortable. Or if you're sharing, videos or images with colleagues after hours, that's still impacting your workplace and your work environment. So maybe there's a group text chain of all of your coworkers, and someone's sending around a meme or a joke or a comment. Just because it's after hours doesn't mean that that's acceptable now. It still could be impacting the workplace. Sexual banter or flirtation. Again, you may feel like the other person is totally okay with this. Even if you're reading the situation correctly and the other person doesn't mind, there may be other people in your work proximity who are uncomfortable with sexual banter going on between you and another person, or maybe uncomfortable because of the flirtation they see happening in the workplace. There's a really great example of this, of every type of hostile work environment in the TV show The Office. If anyone has followed that, it's a mockumentary about a paper company that came out 15 or 20 years ago, following the antics of the paper company CEO or manager, Michael Scott. And at one point in the show, he starts dating the head of HR in his branch. And they're always sitting together in the office, holding hands and, flirtatious tickling and whispering and giggling and kissing in the office. And neither of them mind, but everyone else around them in the workplace who has to see that behavior is made to feel very uncomfortable. So that sexual banter or flirtation, even if the two people or multiple people involved don't mind, the other people around them may still be feeling uncomfortable because of that behavior. And I do see a question in the Q&A from Patty. Patty, I will get to that. What is our recourse when the sexual harassment comes from a client or a volunteer? I will absolutely get to that at the end. That's a great question and one of, I think, the most important questions we can answer. But so this is a non-exhaustive list of some of the types of unwanted sexual harassment that could be creating a hostile work environment. Even if I'm not worried that I'm going to get fired because I'm not flirting back with Sam, if Sam is flirting with me in such a way that it makes me feel uncomfortable, that still could be sexual harassment. Sam doesn't have to have the ability to hire or fire me. If I'm feeling uncomfortable, that still could be something that's creating a hostile work environment. And I see someone in the chat saying, I worked in that kind of environment for 10 years because I was a single mom. I was not in a position to quit. And that is a great point to keep in mind. If you're wondering if this is going on in your workplace and you think, well, no one's quitting, no one's reporting this, no one's telling me that there's a problem, so we must be fine. That's not always the case. It often may be that if we're not proactively thinking about this, if we're just waiting for people to quit or waiting for people to make reports, we may be missing a lot of cases where someone is experiencing this and they just don't have the support that they need to let us know. So we want to be proactive about this and not just reactive. All right, the next type of hostile work environment is sexist harassment. So this is sexist behaviors, even if they're not necessarily sexual in nature. And this is something to be aware of. Another thing that we may not think of as commonly as being a form of sexual harassment, but someone who is treated differently based on their gender is something that can be considered part of what creates a hostile work environment. So if we notice that meetings are always organized and set up and we're only asking people of one gender to get things ready for our meetings, like we all, we're all getting ready for a big meeting in the company and only the female employees are being asked to make the coffee or take the notes in the meeting. That might be something that we recognize that maybe there's some elements of sexist behaviors going on in our workplace. We often see in workplaces derogatory comments towards working mothers or towards certain types of working parents that we wouldn't see on the other side. Again, it's easiest to point to examples in pop culture of these kinds of things. I think of the TV show Parks and Rec, another old show because I don't watch current TV anymore. So you're getting all my examples from things that are at least 10 years old. But there was the TV show Parks and Rec that followed a deputy parks director, Leslie Knope, and eventually her husband, Ben Wyatt, who was running to be the governor of Indiana. And they were on the campaign trail and they were asking Leslie, who's watching the kids right now? And her husband, Ben, who was the person actually running for office, stepped up and said, you know what? People never ask me that. I'm the husband, I'm the man in this situation, but people never ask me where the kids are or who is taking care of the kids. People never assume that because I'm becoming a parent that I'm going to be less dedicated to my job. But we often do see those types of attitudes or those types of behaviors coming out, particularly towards women. In fact, there was a race, I believe it was the governor race, the recall race in California, where one of the candidates who was running to try to replace Gavin Newsom said that he wanted to make it legal again to ask women if they were planning to become pregnant when you were hiring them. so that you could know whether or not someone was planning to become pregnant while they worked for you. And that is blatantly unconstitutional and blatantly illegal in our workplaces for this very reason, because oftentimes in the past, people would say, well, you're a young woman between the ages of maybe 18 and 40. We'd rather not hire you because we think there's a chance you might get pregnant and have to take maternity leave, or you're going to be taking care of the kids. So we think it'd be better to hire a man of a similar age because we're not going to have to worry about him taking, paternity leave or him taking time off to get pregnant. So you see that some of that discrimination against certain types of working parents, or even people who just by their age and gender could potentially be working parents. We see some differences in how we treat different people based on sex and gender. And then sexist nicknames as well. This is something that is very common. It's a very common form of hostile work environment sexual harassment, and it's something that's very normalized in our workplaces, especially when people don't think it's a big deal. They think, well, that's just how I talk, or that's just the way, that's just the way I was raised. I'm just being friendly. I'm just being polite. I'm a relatively young looking woman. I'm not young, but I look young, and I know that. And I have frequently been in workplaces and in professional settings where people called me sweetheart, honey. And while I don't think they meant anything derogatory, I don't think they meant to be rude or to be hurtful, it did constantly send a message to me that I wasn't viewed as an equal, that I wasn't being viewed as an adult professional, that I was still seen by them as, a young kid or a young woman, and I wasn't being treated as an equal. So times when I've come up and I've been a presenter at a conference, and when the person comes to me and says, oh, hon, how are you doing? That sends a message to me that maybe I'm not being treated as professionally as people who have my same qualifications, but just look different than me. So again, it's not usually something where someone is intending to be hurtful or intending to treat me differently or intending to treat your workers differently, but it could be something where the impact of that is that someone comes to work every day and does not feel like they're being treated equally. And that could be the creation of a hostile work environment. Now, usually that's not the only issue going on, but that might be one issue that's there as well, that is sending a message to your staff that we don't think of everyone as equal. Some animals are more equal than others, to quote Animal Farm. So that's something to be aware of, is sometimes these things are not intended to create a hostile work environment, but the impact still could be creating that, and we want to be as proactive as possible. And then finally, hostile work environment. Yes, I see some people in the chat saying that's pretty common in the South. It's more of a cultural issue. Or some people say, we call everyone by an endearment. Sometimes we do it because we can't remember the person's name. Like, the number of times I've had to call someone coach or buddy because I didn't remember, their name in that moment. It's tricky. It could be down to tone. I see some of those things, and it's not something, like I said, that's usually going to come up as the only issue. If the only issue is I come to work and one of my coworkers calls me hun, I'm probably not going to be complaining about that. But that's usually part of a larger culture, and this is one aspect that is showing me that maybe I'm always asked to be the one who's making coffee for the meetings, and I'm the only one who's asked to type up minutes for those meetings. And I notice that my ideas aren't really validated until somebody else says the same thing. And I notice that I'm the one who constantly gets comments on my outfits, and my boss calls me hun. All of those things working together might tell me that this isn't just a cultural thing. This is something where maybe there's a deeper unexamined issue that's going to be making people who look like me or people who are like me feel less comfortable in the workplace, or feel less like I belong in that workplace. And then the last form of hostile work environment, like I said, is gender policing. And this is similar to sexist harassment, but this is when we seek to reinforce traditional gender norms in the workplace by things like policing appearance, gendered nicknames, invasive questions, or assigning jobs by gender. So when we say that women who come to our workplace should be wearing high heels and skirts, and men should be wearing business suits and ties. And if a woman comes to work in a suit and tie, or a man comes to work wearing makeup, we're going to punish them for that, or we're going to have issues with that in our workplace. I've worked with some wonderful people in my time in nonprofit communities who just have not fit a traditional work look. So maybe I'm less interested in wearing high heels and makeup to work. That doesn't make me any less good at my job. Or if I'm, traditionally viewed as masculine, but I come to work and I like to wear nail polish, that doesn't make me any less good at my job. But if you're being forced into these boxes around gender, particularly around gender expression, and saying, because I look at you and I see a man, you need to behave this way and you need to dress this way and you need to look this way. Or because I look at you and I see a woman, you need to dress this way, you need to act this way, and you need to behave this way. That is setting you right up there for a lawsuit, because people don't fit into those boxes. People have the right within professional boundaries to express themselves and express their gender identity the way that they would like to, and they can still be very good employees. So it's very important for us to remember that we want to be careful around policing appearance, and we want to be careful about reinforcing traditional gender norms in the workplace. Things like assuming that female employees are not going to be able to lift the heavy boxes, but your male employees will, or male volunteers are going to be the ones who should unload all the produce off the trucks, and the female volunteers, why don't you go fill out the paperwork for us? I think of a summer camp that I worked at in the summers, and all the women were assigned to do support work in the kitchen. They had to cook meals for the campers when they weren't working directly with the kids themselves, and the men who worked there all got assigned to do maintenance tasks like mowing the lawns and painting buildings. They didn't assign that based on what you were good at. It was solely down to what is your gender on our pieces of paper. And I can tell you, I am not someone who works well in a commercial kitchen. If you ask me to cook for 200 people, I will cry. But put me on a lawnmower and I can mow lawns all day. But because that workplace was, in ways that I didn't realize at the time, struggling with gender and gender policing, there was a hostile work environment created where people were forced into these boundaries that didn't really fit their skills and weren't really assigned by anything that had anything to do with what their actual skills were. Gender nicknames, you're upset with one of your male colleagues, so you call him Sally or Princess. Those kinds of things are, of course, could be creating an offensive or hostile work environment. Asking invasive questions, again, we talked about that earlier, particularly for LGBTQIA+ individuals in your workplace. If you're asking questions that don't have anything to do or don't pertain at all to the kind of work that they can do for your organization, those things could be creating a situation where you could be looking at a hostile work environment lawsuit. And just, you could be creating the kind of environment where a very good worker would not be willing to stay in your organization. When would policing appearances be inappropriate? For example, of thinking of workplaces that require a uniform. There are absolutely times when you can say, our uniform is you wear a white shirt and black pants, and everybody is expected to do that. Or it's expected that you dress business professional in our workplace, or it's expected that you wear your hair up because you're working in a kitchen. Those kinds of workplace uniforms or workplace appearance norms that are applied across the board are fine. But if you were to tell someone, women in the workplace can have their nails painted, but men in the workplace cannot, that would be grounds that you could be looking at a lawsuit for that. Or if you said men have to wear suits and women have to wear dresses, you could be looking at a lawsuit for that. If men can wear, if business professional for men looks like wearing, a tie and a button-up shirt and slacks, you can't say that women have to wear skirts or high heels or things along those lines. Or women can have long hair, but male individuals can't. So if it's something that can be applied equally, that's fine, and it's necessary for your work, that's fine. If it's something that we're applying those rules differently based on gender, that could be something where you can get into trouble. Thanks for that question. I also see another question about companies that protect people who have sexual allegations against them, and we'll talk about that as well. And you're absolutely right, that definitely makes it difficult. So if we're thinking about reporting abuse, some of the places to know would be the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the federal level, and the Illinois Sexual Harassment and Discrimination Hotline, or the Illinois Department of Human Resources. If you are looking to make a report, particularly if you're looking to make a report against a company or an organization that is protecting an individual, or an organization or a company that is not taking appropriate action, you would want to consider filing a lawsuit with the EEOC or with the Illinois Sexual Harassment and Discrimination Office or the Illinois Department of Human Resources. If you are making a report at the federal level with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, you have 180 days from the incident that you're reporting to make that report to them. If you're reporting at the state level to the Illinois Department of Human Resources, you have 300 days from the allegation you're reporting to make that report. Now, usually it's more of a pattern of behavior, but the most recent incident that you're reporting is what you're going to think about for that timeline. When you make a report at one of these agencies, they can also make a report for you with the other. So if you report at the state level, they can also make that report with the EEOC for you, or vice versa. If you're reporting at the federal level with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they can make a report for you at the state level. So you kind of have two opportunities to address those issues that you're facing. However, if you're going to be doing that, you need to be paying attention to that federal timeline of 180 days, because that is a little bit shorter. If you're outside that 180 days, you still could report at the state level, but you would not be able to have that complementary federal lawsuit filed at the same time. So just think about that if you're thinking about what to do. But if you're past the 180 days, that doesn't necessarily mean you're out of luck, because you still have that state option of up to 300 days. The numbers that I have on the screen for the EEOC, 1-800-669-4000. And for the Illinois Sexual Harassment and Discrimination Hotline, 877-236-7703, are starting points that you can look at, that you can contact, and they will assist you with knowing how to file your report from there. So you call those numbers and they will direct you on where to go from there. If you're wondering what those numbers are, or you're wondering what it's going to be like to contact those places, or you want additional support, you can always just contact Safe Passage and we can walk you through that process. We're available 24 hours a day. So if you don't have those numbers memorized off the top of your head, don't worry, you can call us and we can assist you with finding those numbers as well. You also want to consider, as you're thinking about reporting abuse, you have the EEOC, the federal reporting, you have state level reporting, but you certainly can report internally as well. And this is something that's helpful, particularly for organizations that you think will do something. If you are working for a company and it's clear that they're protecting someone, or it's clear that they're not taking appropriate action, well, yes, you're going to maybe need to take that to another level. But within your organization, you can certainly start by making a report internally and giving that organization a chance to fix the problem. I always encourage people to recognize, whether you're a staff member or a member of management, to recognize that reports of sexual harassment are a gift. They are an opportunity for us to fix a problem. A lot of times you have seen in the past that businesses have had those reports and they have kind of circled up and they have said, we're not going to pay attention to this. We're going to protect our employees. We're going to pretend like everything's fine. We don't want trouble. Instead of recognizing that when someone tells you something's wrong, they're giving you an opportunity to be better. And particularly for me, working in nonprofits, we often see that we care about the mission, we care about the cause, we care about the organization. We don't want to hurt the cause by making a report of abuse. But our organizations, our nonprofits, our causes cannot function if abuse is happening internally. So when we report that, we give our causes and our organizations a chance to be better, and we give our companies a chance to be better. So consider the chain of command for reporting within your organization, reporting to your supervisor, reporting to human resources, or reporting to leadership. Go through your chain of command, and if the person that you would report to next isn't helping, or you don't feel safe reporting to them, go one step above and go one step above. And if no one's helping in your organization, don't forget about those state and federal options for reporting. It's also important to know that if you do file a report of harassment, you are protected from retaliation. No one can fire you, no one can cut your hours, no one can move you to a worse shift. No one can keep you off of important emails or out of important meetings because you made this report. And if you notice those things are happening, that you're being treated differently after you filed a report, or you're even blatantly fired after you filed a report, keep that information. That's going to be in addition to your lawsuit that you might be filing, because that's retaliation and you are legally protected from that as well. So I know I am running out of time, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions, but I just want to talk briefly about bystander intervention, make sure we're aware of what we can do. If we see some of these things going on, maybe it's not happening directly to us, we're not the person who's doing it, but we see something happening. We have the choice about whether or not we get involved. We know that harassment persists not because it isn't noticed, but because it's tolerated. It's not that people didn't know that Harvey Weinstein was doing bad things. It's not that people didn't know that Bill Cosby was doing bad things. It's not that people didn't know that Andrew Cuomo was creepy. It's that people kind of knew it and just said, it's not my problem. I don't know what to do about it. I'm not involved. I don't need to do anything, or it's not my issue. I don't have to get involved. And we really want to change that mindset, because research has shown that what makes the biggest difference in preventing sexual harassment in our workplaces is the workplace culture. It's not the individuals and whether or not they're going to be harassing. It's about how they think other people will respond to their behavior. So when you take someone who's been very harassing in one workplace and put them in another workplace where it is very clear from the beginning that that is not tolerated, that person doesn't do that in that new workplace culture. So when it becomes very clear that in our workplace, we don't tolerate harassing behaviors, we don't tolerate inappropriate jokes, we don't tolerate bullying, when people know that that is just not accepted here, people don't try to get away with it. People try to get away with it when they think they will. So when we can create a culture that says, we're not going to turn away from this, we're not going to ignore it, we're going to actively get involved. That is the best thing we can do for preventing sexual harassment in our workplaces. And I want to give you just one kind of option for how to address behaviors, particularly when it's something that, you know, it's not blatantly illegal. Maybe I think it's not even intentional. Maybe this is just something where someone doesn't realize the impact they're having. They don't realize that this is inappropriate, or I want to give them a chance to do something better. There's a 3-step process we use. 1, name the behavior, set a limit, and then move on. So name the behavior. I overheard that joke that you just told. That's not the kinds of things we say here. And then move on. So name the behavior. I overheard that joke you just told. Set a limit. We don't tell those kinds of jokes here. And then move on. Don't make a big show out of it. It doesn't have to be a write-up. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be a feminist soapbox rant that we get on. It just has to be, we say, you know, I noticed that you keep giving Crystal a back massage as she's sitting at her desk. That's not an appropriate way to interact with your colleague. Please don't do that again. Or you keep walking really close behind me when you're going to the shelves over here. I'd really appreciate it if you would just ask me to move out of your way. Or I'd really appreciate it if you waited until I wasn't there and not pass so close behind me. So name the behavior. You're walking too close behind me. Set a limit. I'd prefer if you asked me to move. And then move on. And as long as that person takes that note and changes, we're all okay. It doesn't have to be a big deal. We don't have to fire them over that. But when we follow those steps and we intervene early on, we can change that behavior before it becomes a liability. Now, if someone keeps doing it, even though they've been warned, then we might need to take higher levels of redirection, or we might need to take further action. But if this works, this is a great way to be a good bystander, to say, I overheard that joke you just told. I see what you're doing. It looks like you're making that person uncomfortable. Set a limit. Please don't do that anymore. And then move on. Give them a chance to change. And then if they don't, we'll take further action. But name the behavior, set a limit, and then move on. And the keys to success here, this is not rocket science. I have not told you anything today that I'm sure you didn't already know. There's nothing I said that you couldn't have figured out on your own. This is basic kindergarten level. Treat others the way you want to be treated. But this is what's so important to know, is it is very simple for us to create these safe work environments. All we have to do is be civil, create a culture where we expect respect in our workplaces, make reports, recognize that abuse does thrive in silence, and when it's safe to do so, please make a report and help your workplace to be safer and to improve. And if you're in a position of management, let your staff know that you value those reports and that you encourage that. Be proactive about making sure people know that they can come to you. And then be a bystander. If we see something happening, particularly when it's still at that attitude of the jokes or the attitudes that we're noticing before it turns into behavior, call those things out. Let someone know we don't talk like that here. We don't make jokes like that here. That question was inappropriate. That's not how we behave here. Speak up sooner and make sure your colleagues know what kind of behavior we expect, and make sure people who are experiencing harassment know that you're a safe person they could go to if they needed help. So I'm going to leave my contact information up here while I turn to some questions. If you have any questions that you would like to address more directly, please feel free to email me or to call me directly. You can also follow Safe Passage. We're on the web, safepassagetv.org. You can call or text us 24 hours a day. We're on any social media platform you might want. If you want to keep our numbers handy, all those numbers are always in our social media bios. And then I'm going to turn to some of these questions. What is our recourse when sexual harassment comes from a client or volunteer? This is really a situation where I think it comes down to management setting expectations for this. It's really important for management to say, if our staff are being harassed by a client, or if our staff are being harassed by a volunteer or someone who, who supports us, someone who shops here, someone who works here, that we say that that kind of behavior isn't tolerated there either. I particularly see this coming up in nonprofits that rely heavily on volunteers and maybe have to terminate a volunteer's ability to continue working with them, or in organizations like salons and things that may have inappropriate clients, and managers who are willing to say, we appreciate you volunteering, but if you're behaving this way, you can't continue to come back. Or we appreciate your business, but if you're going to be harassing our staff, your business isn't worth that to us. The worst thing a manager could do is say, we can't risk losing that sale, or we can't risk losing that volunteer, or we can't risk losing that donor, so you just have to put up with it. That's the worst thing we could see. So we really want to have management that says, if the sexual harassment comes from a client or a volunteer, then we need to shut that down. It's hard to file a report of sexual harassment against a client or a volunteer or someone who's purchasing from you. However, you can still file a report of sexual harassment against a workplace that's not taking those issues seriously, because that could be creating a hostile work environment. So if that is coming up, you can file a sexual harassment lawsuit against your company for failing to protect you from that sexual harassment coming from your clients or your volunteers. Another question I had in the Q&A, with the rise of demonization of cancel culture, do you see more reluctance of victims reporting abuse or harassment? I will say I don't think we've ever had a good track record of encouraging victims to report abuse or harassment. I think things got a little bit better. We saw a little more encouragement of people to report after the Me Too movement really spiked, but it's never been great. It's never been easy for victims to see that they'd be supported. And yeah, when I see cancel culture, what always frustrates me with that is I think it's less cancel culture and it's more accountability. People aren't being canceled, they're being held accountable for their actions. And I do think when we see pushback against that, that does force victims back into kind of feeling closeted with their concerns. So the more that we can look at reports, and instead of blaming victims for coming forward or saying, oh, they're just looking for a payout, or oh, they're just angry, or oh, it's just cancel culture run amok. If when someone comes forward, we say, thank you, thanks for giving us the opportunity to improve, I believe you, this is unacceptable, we send a message not just to that person that what they did was right, we also send a message to other victims who are wondering if it's safe to come forward. So you may not realize it, but your response to one person could really set the tone for other victims who are wondering, is it safe for me to come forward and report? Or even, is it safe for me to come forward and get support from a counselor, or tell someone what's going on and not just deal with this on my own? So the more we can create a culture of saying to victims that we believe them, and worry less about cancel culture and more about holding people accountable for their behavior, the more victims are going to feel safe to report that abuse, and the more we can really create the kind of safe culture that we all deserve to have and that we all want. So I think I answered that one. Are there other questions that I can answer? Feel free to jump in the Q&A, or feel free to jump in the chat. I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, seeing none, and knowing that you've shared your contact information and been gracious with that, perhaps people can follow up with you if they have additional questions down the road.
Absolutely, please feel free.
Great. Thank you so much, Linnea. For those of you who don't know, Linnea has recently accepted a position with the U.S. State Department, and she's going to be leaving the area for that opportunity very soon. So Linnea, I just want to thank you for being such a valued resource locally, and best of luck to you in this next phase of your career.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining me today, and thank you to DCNP for putting this together.
Linnea. As mentioned earlier, you should expect 2 follow-up emails, one with the recording and the slides, and another that is a certificate of participation for all attendees. Again, we ask that you please monitor your spam and junk folders in case those emails are filtered from your inbox. We ask that you please note we can't send a certificate if members of your team view the recording later. It's only going to go to those who registered and attended this session live. You can use that recording for your staff. You'll just need to do your own documentation that the training has been completed by those individuals who may access the recording later on. For those of you representing nonprofit organizations, you can visit dcnp.org for upcoming opportunities. We just launched our 2022 membership drive, and you can renew or become a member right from the website. In closing, I just want to thank the chambers who partnered on this event and thank all who attended. And one more time, a big thank you goes to Linnea Erickson-Laskowski for sharing her time and expertise with all of us. Take care and happy holidays.